In the 23rd century, our home planet of Earth was ravaged by a global climate disaster. So much of our planet had become uninhabitable by the exponential growth of the human population. The only hope for mankind's survival was to leave their home for new ones in the galaxy. During man's exodus from Earth, much of our records, history, and culture was left behind on the dying planet. This knowledge was lost to us for thousands of years before recolonization of our home planet began, almost 200 years ago. Records recovered shine light on our species' earliest moments, and possibly even paint a picture of how modern humanity came to be what we are today. This is Rediscovering Humanity. In the early 21st century, the political landscape of Earth was very tense. This was pre-planetary colonization, and the Earth was still the only planet humans lived on. With so many people and only one planet to spread out on, the world was indeed a very small place. Tensions for land and resources dominated humanity even more than it does for us today. We are here today at the 21st Century Wing of the Human History Museum to talk with Dr. Todd Livy about how these tensions influenced early humans.
Historians for thousands of years have been curious about mankind's early evolution. With our loss of records from before the planetary exodus of Earth, we have little information about where our species came from and how we came to be what we are today.
Humanity is the only species we know of that engages in interspecies warlike behavior. Why this is the case is a question that sociologists and evolutionary biologists alike have yet to be able to answer. But a look into newly uncovered records may give us a glimpse as to how our modern methods of warfare may have gotten its beginning.
One thing that early pre-expansion humans kept extensive records of was their conflicts with other groups. We have an extensive timeline of human wars and conflicts dating back about 9,000 years ago. While we aren't sure if this is an exhaustive list, or if conflict dates back even further, we do know that the closer in centuries we get to the Great Planetary Exodus of 2359, the more frequent recorded conflicts appear. This leads us to believe that conflicts appear to be correlated with a struggle for resources.
But if fighting over limited resources are what started conflict between humans, then why do we still fight today in a post-scarcity society? While this is a question that confounds the scientific community to this day, we can at least learn how our methods of conflict began. We do everything we can to prevent full-scale war between sovereign planetary systems, but sometimes violent conflict breaks out on a large scale. Most of the fighting happens via artificial intelligence and proxy wars between robotic combatants. We have succeeded in developing systems in place to avoid direct fighting ourselves, but this drive to avoid direct combat may be older than we think.
During the Second Earth War, nuclear weapons had been developed for the first time in human history, and they had no way to protect themselves from such weapons at the time. We today are fortunate to have planetary defense networks set up to detect and disable any such weapons before they become a threat. Early humans played on a much smaller field. This prevented conventional war due to the risk of the unimaginable damage atomic weapons could cause, even for the time. And this inability to fight directly led to alliances and divides that shaped the geopolitical landscape of the entire Earth for centuries.
But a new invention allowed for the fighting to begin again: drones. Unmanned vehicles able to inflict devastating damage.
They typically took the shape of flying or hovering vehicles or aircraft. They lacked the presence of an onboard pilot as our weapons of war do today, but they had not reached the level of computational intelligence that we have today. And so it seems that they would be piloted and monitored by remote-controlled access points.
The first test of drones in combat would come from a series of conflicts called the Cold War. Recovered historical texts refer to these conflicts as proxy battles due to them being fought by drones in remote areas rather than by human combatants as the First and Second Earth Wars of the early 20th century were.
Most of the information we have on the Cold War comes from one of the two main factions of the war, an alliance of nations who called themselves the United States of America. We believe they referred to it as the Cold War due to their rival being another series of aligned states called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and that these nations had a reputation for having severe winter weather.
These proxy wars lasted for several decades, with different factions rising and falling, all vying for total control of all of Earth. They fought themselves into a stalemate that led to great social uprisings throughout the differing nations. This led many nations to bring the might of their drone fighters onto their own civilian populations.
Records of civilian casualties, data mined from ancient server storage buildings, show shocking numbers. While records vary in their ability to differentiate between civilian and government casualties, the numbers list into the hundreds of thousands. It is believed that the numbers of those who actually died are much higher than those reported. The damage caused from drones alone would have made finding and identifying bodies quite difficult to begin with, as well as laws and policies at the time preventing accurate records from being taken and even preserved. We also don't know how much data we are missing from that time.
Data miners are constantly salvaging lost data from the old net, but with most data storage sites from the time being horribly damaged from the climate crisis of the third millennia, it seems many records of the time are lost to history. Newly emerged video files, data mined from an ancient 21st century social media database known as Twitter, shows that people may have used early forms of laser weapons to bring down the hostile drones.
As soon as civilian populations became a target of such deadly devices, it became clear that they needed some kind of equalizer. A video discovered by the I.O. Institute of Electronic Archaeology clearly shows some kind of energy weapon being used by a crowd to disable such a drone. But it's unclear as of now whether the device was intended to direct heat to melt through the device, or if it was used as some kind of signal interference to shut remote control drones out from its control device.
Around the same time, we see many areas banning the use of drones in the proximity of important sites such as airports. Even some civilian governments began to make flying them in the city limits illegal. Such drones became scarce as a use of policing until more technological developments came about. But we currently have no records of how remote piloted aircraft evolved into the computer-operated machines we use today.
Entire geographical regions at the time were characterized by the damage of drone warfare for generations, none more so than the region they called the Middle East.
Drone strikes in the Middle East were largely intended for military targets, but many civilian targets would also be struck. These weapons were advertised at the time to be extremely accurate. But then, if they were so accurate, why is there such a high rate of collateral damage? Was the marketing for them full of lies? Or were civilians deliberately targeted?
When looking back on our past, we have to remember that our technology and standards are much higher than that of the time. For example, we today have very strict standards of sustainability as opposed to the comparatively non-existent standards of the 21st century. Now, this is primarily because we have lived to see the reckoning that the destructive policies of our ancestors caused. When arms dealers of the early 2000s made claims as to the effectiveness of their weapons, they're making claims based on the standards that were expected at the time. So while those levels of collateral damage would be unimaginable to us today, that was just the way things were for them.
But new evidence might show that it isn't even good enough for the time. Records recently uncovered show that much of the political activist activity in countries responsible for launching drone attacks in the Middle East were from groups and individuals against the drone wars in the region.
There is a misconception when looking back at our primitive ancestors in the 20th and 21st centuries that they are far less intelligent and far less evolved than humans today. We think of those early humans as being much more violent, much more self-centered, and much less able to consider future consequences against immediate satisfaction. There is some truth to this overall as a society, but the individual human was much more complex.
Evolutionary biologists have found that the humans of the time were not much different from us. Their brain functions almost the exact same way, except their brains were a bit larger. This smaller brain size we have today is believed to be an evolutionary trait caused by more structured society, that it relieves some of the necessity of brain capacity because society will take care of things. So perhaps there is some truth that humans of the time were much more self-centered.